I do know that he was a very dynamic character. He meant his ties to intelligence just don't end, and I don't know if it was intentional or if he knew about, because like when he grew up, he was in Desmoulins, and Desmoulins is kind of like Freemasonry for kids, right? It's like their Cub Scout version before you're old enough to join real Freemasonry.
All right, we are joined by Tom Gorence, and Tom is part of the website and show Paranoid American. Tom does cool stuff like this right here. He was kind enough to send me this pamphlet, which is all about MK Ultra. Folks who have seen me know I'm into that. And he does other amazing artwork like these cards that he shared with as well.
Yeah, I've got so much. I just got literally 400 pounds of comics showed up in my driveway yesterday, so I did a full restock. I'll
Nice.
send you some other ones too soon.
Oh, awesome. I look forward to that. I love your work. I like the style of it. And you were kind enough to have me on your show recently, and we got sidetracked. I found out, hey, you used to work for Disney. Hey, you're interested in conspiracies. So what could be a better topic of the day than your time at Disney and the current status and history of Disney?
Let's do it, man. I mean, yeah, and I would say I'm more than just interested in conspiracies. Like they've been all consuming since I was, pre-puberty. So I've always loved conspiracy theory, and I've kind of see it as our version of mythology, at least like American pop culture mythology.
I do find those parallels fascinating. I never want to talk down to the pop culture because it's important to us growing up and influencing us and having actual heroes. Where I get distressed is I feel like it has been infiltrated by a bunch of, lack of better words, communists who quite literally want to destroy the culture in any way they can through the means of our art. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but that's sort of my view.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see it. I also think that there's this interesting divide of people that are just vehemently non-creative in this particular space, animation, writing, like sort of building fictional universes that draw on archetypes and morality and stuff. And then you've got like the serial entrepreneurs that just know how to be really creative and making money. And it's a very lopsided dynamic. I mean, you can look at on its own tangent, but if you look at like the history of Bohemian Grove, right? It was essentially a bunch of artists in the very late 19th century that were just tired of working for all of the corporate gigs, and like that's where all the money came from. So they would just go into a retreat and just do their own thing for a while, like dress up and put on plays and do the art that they want to do. That was why it was called the Bohemian Club. And over time they ran out of money, so they had to bring in sponsorships, and the sponsors came in and they were like, hey, this is a nice little ritual you got going here. I like the redwoods. Maybe we'll come back next year. And over time, that lopsided dynamic where like one side's got all the money and the resources and the connections and the time to do it all. So they basically take over Bohemian Club, and now they kind of like hire artists and hire musicians to come and entertain them at their rituals, right? At the spring hijinks and whatnot. So it's very similar when you get into Hollywood, I think. Like it started on merit, and then the business comes in and they know how to make money, and now like the dynamics lopsided.
I guess, but it's a little different on that front. I want to point out that you brought up Bohemian Grove. I wonder if Burning Man is a parallel to that.
We've got a huge tangent on this one, but like Bohemian Grove is the inversion of the Golden Bough, where the Golden Bough was this previous matriarchy, and this ties directly into Disney, by the way, Beauty and the Beast in particular. But Golden Bough basically said that royalty and dynasties would be traversed through the lineage of the daughter. Like it would have to be this prince that would come from a foreign land, usually disguised. They'd have to win a merit-based contest. Disney Robin Hood's probably the most direct analogy here, where he like sneaks into the competition. He's in, garb. He wins based on merit alone. But the end of the Golden Bough, this is a long series of books by Fraser from the 1800s too. is that in order to take over the kingdom, you have to marry the daughter and kill the king. So Bohemian Grove inverts this, where the person coming in to overthrow the kingdom, that's Care, but Bohemian Grove, they kill Care, right? They burn Care as this effigy, and they make sure that no, the king is going to continue ruling, and this like patriarchy is going to continue ruling, and that's where the dynasty and the nepotism can live on forever, as long as they keep repeating this cremation to Care ritual. And in my mind, Burning Man is kind of like that, but just for Silicon Valley / hippies, but a little bit more accessible.
But the money's moving in.
Oh, yeah, dude,
That's what
yeah.
I was thinking. It's
The
like
same exact
this is like
lopsided
a echo,
dynamic.
perfect echo, where you have all the hippies are out there partying, doing drugs, having a good time, sex rituals, whatever it is, and then, well, a lot of those hippies happen to be in Silicon Valley, and they happen to come with the money. They're moving into power, and thus we get Twitter files. Thus we get all this. Now, you did say something that I'm going to push back on just slightly, because it is odd. You had mentioned how the money comes in and it corrupts because they're able to make money on products, and that kind of trashes the original story. But that's not really happening right now, especially with Disney and things like that. You have literally a woke infection where you've heard the phrase, get woke, go broke. I think that's being proven over and over and over again. And it is confusing to me. Why is it the big money is coming in and then hiring the Kathleen Kennedys to create this content that is destroying the company, in my opinion?
Maybe, although I would always say on this particular context, if you zoom out a little bit and look at through like a Fabian Society style lens, where we're not talking about making an impact within decades. I mean, that was definitely an Eisner approach, and just like, hey, we need to get this thing profitable immediately. But there's also a shift. Comic books is a great analogy here too, where originally the comic book was the product. You had to put out a good comic, and it had to be, have merit, and it had to be priced strategically and everything. Like, you would go to the grocery store or whatever. We're talking 50s, 60s, 70s. That was the actual product. But then at a certain point, the action figures and the t-shirts and the lunch pails that you get at Walmart and all of those sort of secondary products, they become way more profitable, right? The Happy Meal toy is going to bring in way more than the comic sales. In fact, at this point, a lot of comic books sell at a loss because they're just seen as like the promotional arm of all this other stuff going on. Go buy the movies, go buy the sneakers, go buy the branded, Avengers Sasquatch soap bars that it's like they just put Captain America on the front, but it's soap, but you buy it and they get a cut. So that's the new dynamic. And if you zoom out and look at it from like a Fabian perspective, right, you don't get a chance to sell Captain America soap bars to kids unless you've got all this other, previous history built upon. So switching back to Disney, right? Like, why do they come out with a crappy Lion King when the previous one was better? Why are they wasting the money doing this? Why are they reshooting Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, all this money? Well, because, and I think we went into this in my show, conspiracy theory minded, but maybe they released that crappier one because they know it'll at least balance out or get people thinking about the old Lion King again. And now the old Lion King gets a resurgence in its vault purchases and Disney Plus signups. And it's just another excuse. Think of it like as a loss leader promotion in order to get the Lion King, as Disney sort of perceives it and projects it, as the thing. Like that becomes this dynasty where someone says Pinocchio, right? How many people are actually thinking about the original Italian artwork in the original story? They're probably thinking of the Disney version. So Disney has a chance to actually own folklore, and they get to own nostalgia in a way that I don't think any other company really has been able to get that kind of a stranglehold on. And with them basically inheriting and purchasing Marvel and getting it to do the exact same thing, yeah, our new gods are these superheroes. So now when Disney owns all of the old Germanic folklore, which wasn't even that substantial until Disney really kind of like threw some steroids in the mix. Like, I don't know, Disney owns our childhood at this point. So how much is that worth to you? So at a Fabian Society standpoint, it's not how much the movie made.
I guess, but that still seems counterintuitive. For example, Pride and Prejudice is made every 15, 20 years over and over and over and over. And it kind of is like it picks up a new generation every time it's remade. But they're not remaking it saying, oh, let's see if we can take a dump all over the original story and that's going to prop up the original. It starts to get a little bit confusing. Like the Snow White, we'll go with that one for a little bit, where you have a star literally shitting all over the original thing. Oh, he's not a prince, he's a stalker. Oh, yeah, that's going to go over well, etc. It doesn't make sense to me. It can be a derivative, and the original might be better, but do you want the derivative to be complete garbage? I would think that maybe they're correcting it, and that's why they're delaying it a year to do something crazy like put dwarves in. Still not hiring actual people who are dwarves, mind you. Well, it's like, that's a bridge too far, Peter Dinklage. I'm sorry, Peter. We worship you, Dwarf King. We'll use CGI and screw over all the other little people that you don't seem to give a damn about. Got that. But
yeah, I mean, you have an interesting role in Game of Thrones, but it doesn't mean you get to speak on behalf of nostalgia and Disney and everything in general.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, and it's like, for God's sake, if you're a dwarf, how many parts come along that are exactly on point? It's the 7 dwarves. They're dwarves. I mean, we're talking about diversity and everything else, right? I mean, oh my God. Anyway, but that's a rant. What do you think about Daily Wire coming along? And I think it's kind of a brilliant move, but just saying, yeah, we're going to make Snow White. And I realized that following what you're saying, that the image of Snow White burned in my head as Disney. And my initial reaction was thinking, oh, geez, how's that going to work with trademark? Look how they are with Mickey Mouse. And then I thought, oh, that's right. It wasn't Disney's.
Right.
They just made a version of it. Anybody can make Snow White. There's no copyright whatsoever on Snow White. Only if you use their character, then we might run into problems. But the tale, I don't know. It's proceeding.
There's layers on top of that because Disney owns the image in your mind of what it looks like, right? But they also, in almost every single story, they dramatically change specific aspects of it and make it a lot more palpable. So then if you were to retell like the original version of some of these stories, they don't have the exact same feel, and like they can't capitalize on the same exact nostalgia that Disney's been implanting for decades, right? So you can come out with the, Winnie the Pooh horror movie, which, admittedly was like kind of low budget in the places where maybe it needed it, but like the only reason people cared about that was because there's this nostalgia that's built up in your mind. If it was just some random, public domain story from the 1800s that no one had already adapted and spent billions and billions of dollars putting into the public consciousness for, generations, then, that's where all the value is. So the extra layer that I'm getting at here is that they can now, so like, well, if you copy what they changed in the original story and it feels like maybe you also changed it in a way that they changed it, whose team has more lawyers on it and that can, invest more in this and has like Disney has legal precedent to the point where, like a normal corporation, they probably dwarf the amount of, legal and litigation and precedents that they personally have set in court. So it feels just like, if you look at it from a Fabian Society standpoint, how much would it be worth to own nostalgia for 3, 4, 5 plus generations indefinitely? And why are they making this like, woke version that feels inferior? Maybe it's like another version of like the Common Core where you're just separating what everybody knows from their parents, right? So I know Lion King is this, or I know Snow White is this, but my kid knows it is this, and they go to school and told that the old one's problematic, and you put it on Disney Plus and it has a little disclaimer before, Song of the South. It's like, this was made back when people hated each other, and I don't know if you've seen any of those little disclaimers they put up.
I did.
But it's just one extra way to say, hey, this is my Disney proxy theory, but hey, those authority figures in your house that you call your parents that think they know everything? Well, Disney actually knows a little bit more than them. So listen to us, and here's the way that things really work. And that's what every Disney movie itself is too, right? They knock out the authority figure almost immediately, and they give you this IP. And just to put a button on top of the Pride and Prejudice analogy, right? It's a decent one, but Pride and Prejudice doesn't have the same amount of like a die cut cartoon sticker that a child can just immediately turn into a sigil before they know what sigils are, right? Pride and Prejudice maybe, but it's also not aimed at the same thing as like a talking rabbit that's really cute. Once you get to that sort of a level, I think it takes on a much deeper kind of meaning.
Okay, interesting. And that's the best I could do in a short period. I'm just thinking in terms of taking something traditional, remaking it over and over. Usually they don't try to do it at a and trashing it. And I think that's
Well,
part of
if
the
you look at
infection.
if you look at like the production on say Jungle Book, right? Walt actively told everybody working on the original Jungle Book, don't read the source material. Like, I don't care what the source material says. We're just going to use certain thematic elements from it and use that as like this loose framework. But it would be someone comes in and just knocks down the house, and we're like, we'll use the foundation, but everything else has got to go. So the same exact argument could probably be made even when the classics came out, where it's like, oh, Disney is completely neutering the story, and which he did, but it also was the only way to make a lot of these things palpable, where you'd still show it to a kid even now, right? Like if you showed the actual
Oh,
story of
a lot
Little
of them are
Mermaid,
dark.
where they're trying to steal a soul, it takes on a different story.
Yeah, which are actually fun. But yeah, so a lot of the original tales I think come out of Grimm's and things like that. And Grimm is a perfect name for a lot of the stories. They're very, very dark in the original format because they're, if I recall, they were to help train kids on how to act like good people or bad things happen to you.
Right. It was like hellfire type stories. And Grimm in particular is an interesting aspect of this, because before Grimm's fairy tales, they were historians. Like they wrote the book on
Right. They
Germanic
collected them.
folklore
Yeah.
from a very factual standpoint, not, from like a fairy tale standpoint. And then through that work, that I think they just really focused like, hey, we can actually explore just folklore, get a full index of every story and kind of compile it, and it becomes wildly successful. But they truly were historians, and a thing that is very hard to underestimate is how influential not just Grimm was, but Walt Disney now by proxy. A lot of those stories that we take for granted as part of, like, you'd even say like American culture, never would have kind of seen the light of day. And further than that, without Disney basically adapting Grimm and turning them into these big franchises. But on top of that, that entire aspect of Grimm becoming wildly popular was also this resurgence in Germanic sort of, culture and heritage. And without the Grimms publishing that, there might not have even been like the same dynamics following the Weimar Republic and World War II, because that whole like Thule society, let's tap back into like this superior sort of race based on folklore, was very much fueled by Grimm and by proxy Disney, which is when you start talking about Disney World War II, a lot of interesting dynamics pop up.
Kind of like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, who
Right, they had like signed pictures, like like signed yearbooks on each other's desk that said besties on them.
yeah, which is dark, but it's not just them. If I recall, FDR wrote a love letter to Mussolini, and we can go down the line. There's plenty of dark things there. But let's go ahead and start talking about your time at Disney. What did you do? How did you get in there? What's that about?
Yeah, so I was I'll give you the quick version up until I got there. I've been a computer programmer since I was like 8 basically, and I went into the military as a computer programmer and got out, and I was just trying my best to do anything other than like bank software and web admin and type stuff. And there was an opportunity to start learning more about like 3D and game design, and After Effects was getting slightly big. This is like the mid 2000s, and I had just had music placed on Adult Swim through some completely unrelated sort of aspect of what I was working on, and it just lit this fire under me. It was like, I really would love to work on cartoons and movies and games in a bigger way and not just indie stuff. So I ended up going to school here in Orlando and got out and immediately got a job working for Disney at the park. Although I didn't realize it was Disney because, and you even mentioned like you looked at my LinkedIn, it didn't necessarily say it on there. The company was called Ideas, or originally was Intelli Arts and Design, and basically it started as a post-production facility that was entirely owned by Disney and worked exclusively on Disney property, and did a lot of things like in park and TV shows and movies. There's a lot of products that go through Disney people don't even realize. That Adam Sandler Christmas movie, I can't remember the exact name, it's like 11 Nights or something, that was also run through Disney. Like the production that I worked in, that was the shop that actually did a lot of the post effects. They had a huge Foley stage. They had like a huge theater. You could actually record like a 40-piece orchestra in like the studio that was like 3 doors down from where I was at. And the room that I initially worked in was called the Fishbowl. And anyone that would go and take the backlot tour at the Walt Disney World, it's now called Hollywood Studios, but if you took that tour back in the 90s, it would take you right through this backlot and go around what we would call the fishbowl, because they could look in and like see people working at the desks on these big animation desks. And it was cool because I actually sat at one of those huge drafting tables that, you know, animators were working at, but I was just on a computer working in like After Effects or Adobe Flash was pretty big, or Macromedia Flash at the time, for doing like lots of like little art animation type stuff. So that was how I got my foot in the door. And then over working there for 10 years, I ended up doing a lot more sort of interactive design. We made games and movies and all sorts of stuff that got played in the park and on TV. So that was my entire venture. If anyone's ever been to Epcot Center, for example, and they kick you off at the very end, all those like games and interactive, you know, tablets and huge like life-size kiosks, all that was also stuff that I would usually work on.
Dude, that's amazing. On the note of Flash, here's a part of my dark
Yeah,
history.
man. But fun fact, I was the first person in the military that got trained in Flash for my job. This was in 2001 or 2002.
Wow.
Yeah, I actually put in and went and got trained in that, and Dreamweaver and Fireworks and Flash for the Air Force. It's just pretty
I
crazy.
love Fireworks. I miss that to this day. I feel like for the web, it was a superior product to Photoshop in every way, at least at the time.
It's gonna get nerdy real fast.
Now
Man.
it's too late now. But
that.
anyway, getting back to that. So, it sounds to me like you were in the middle of a playground in a lot of ways. I mean, that had to feel just like all this cool stuff going around all the time.
When you could get out of a meeting and say, "Hey, let's go hit Tower of Terror 3 times in a row before we go back to work," and that was a normal Wednesday, right? Yeah, this was 2003, or no, yeah, 2003 through about 2012, and then we moved off of Disney property into downtown Orlando proper, because they wanted to take the building we were at, which is the Roy O. Disney building, Walt's brother, and they basically wanted to knock it down and repurpose it for more room for Star Wars.
So what made you go ahead and leave it? I mean, it seems like that would be a great career.
It was, although once they moved off of Disney property, they started getting a lot less Disney work, not just because geographically, but because like we were just starting to focus on other stuff. We had a huge contract with Hoot Mifflin Harcourt where we were remaking Oregon Trail and Carmen Sandiego and stuff. Like there was lots of really cool nostalgia factor for me projects that we kept working on. But a little inside baseball, it got a little bit weird because we retained some of that like Disney family friendly stuff. For example, we turned down projects where someone wanted to shoot a major documentary on like the Second Amendment, and there was just people in the company that were very anti Second Amendment, so they would turn down projects left and right that would have kept us, you know, like well paid and in business for a lot longer. And then by turning those things down, it was like more stress. The work was crappier. I literally ended up making bank websites at some points to like keep income coming through. So I mean, at that point, and we were off property, so I couldn't go and ride Tower of Terror anymore. So a lot of that original benefit, there was no Foley studio. Like originally when I was working there, you know, like Ryan Seacrest or Queen Latifah or Michael Winslow from Police Academy might just be there like in the office one day or for like a week in case of Winslow, and he irritated everybody. but like all of those benefits just kind of went away immediately after moving off property. And yeah, and just the irony here, we turned down the Second Amendment documentary, which would have kept us in, like not sweating over stupid jobs for a year. But then we were chasing after the director of Boondock Saints to make an online video game for them, which was just crazy. But it's like, if it's in Hollywood, then you can shoot 100 people and it's fine. But if it's like a legitimate political company that wants to, advocate Second Amendment rights, then that's not okay. And it was so a little combination of losing the perks and like the weird direction, all kind of culminated.
It would be like, yeah, you're anti-Second Amendment, but let's make Grand Theft Auto.
Right. It was weird. It was just weird decisions. So, and it wasn't like entirely like I left. It was people started leaving and dropping off, and then they started, switching some people from full time to hourly. So there was a little bit of writing on the wall aspect going too. And yeah, I just kind of jumped ship, and at that point, I took that as my catalyst. Just put all your like anything that I wanted to open up and do After Effects in, do it for yourself. Do it for your own comics and your own artwork. So, and that was also the big catalyst for me even starting Paranoid American and doing all this, because like I mentioned, I've been a conspiracy theorist since forever. And I found myself, I just remember one day I was like sitting and I looked to my left, and there was a guy that worked on the original Lion King, like one of the animators. And I looked to my right, and there was Jesse Schnell, who was like the guy that wrote the art of game design, because we were working on some in park stuff. And I was just like, I'm in this situation. How can I use these tools that are around me and be like, hey, like sketch me a picture of Lawrence King or something, right? Or draw me a picture of Craig Spence, this guy that might have been a CIA informant during the Franklin scandal. Like, they don't know who this stuff is, but now I've got like a legitimate credentialed Disney artist drawing like the most wild MK Ultra Project Monarch stuff. And as soon as I saw that happening in front of me, I was like, I want to do this now. Like, this is all I want to do when I open up Photoshop, is like, I want to do conspiracy theory meets Disney.
Dude, and I hope it explodes, because it's nice to have another option. So while we're on it, let's get into some of the Disney conspiracies. And again, we talked about it before. I have a theory about some of these Easter eggs. I'll call them Easter eggs in the film, because I've seen the different videos. And if I recall, Walt Disney had some legal problems with some of his animators. One in particular, who they hated each other's guts completely. I mean, this guy was like a head animator, brilliant guy. I think he created Goofy, the character, and that's why you don't see Goofy anymore. And Pluto came up just as a way to push down this animator. But the Supreme Court, or somehow Disney, was mandated that he had to keep this guy working for him. And I was wondering if some of these animators and some of this bad blood led to slipping in, shall we say, dick pics inside of animations or other untoward things. What are your thoughts?
Maybe, although the most egregious examples of those were all way after Walt Disney himself was either like on his way out of the picture or had already been dead for a while. Like the big ones would kind of be like Little Mermaid, and the priest gets the erection, maybe there's dicks in the castles behind them and stuff. This is all way post Disney. The earliest and most on the nose examples from the Rescuers. And Disney has repeatedly said about, and for anyone that's not aware, there's a very fraction of a scene when the main characters are like flying in a sardine tin or something, and in the background you've got these huge apartment buildings, and for a brief moment in time, like 3 frames, there's a actual photo of a lady that's disrobing, and you basically see full frontal nudity in the middle of this frame. But Disney claimed that it was not in the theatrical release, which is really hard to prove now. Like, unless you have the theatrical film reel and Disney certifies that was one that made. So they just kind of said, oh no one ever saw that in the theaters. That happened by a third-party distributor while they were converting to Laserdisc, and that's where it happened. It was at the distributor level outside the Disney company. It feels impossible to be able to prove that one way or the other. So they've kind of hand waved that one away, but that one 100% somebody inserted nudity into this thing in Disney, and it was very covert. So why would they do that? I mean, for the lulz, people still do stuff for the lulz today, right? And it doesn't require too much of like a nefarious backplot. Even if it were someone in the studio or the distributor, it still feels like the motive doesn't really matter as much as that it got out there and is in public consciousness, and Disney hand waves it. Every other example, we're talking about the animators, right? So one that comes up is the Lion King. They jump on a pile of dust or feathers or leaves or something, and it spells out the word sex in the sky. Disney hand waved that one as saying, well, this was the new SFX department, the new special effects department, and this was one of their big ways to show, like, look how intricate we can be and take little dust particles and make it form a word and then dissipate. So I don't know that, and honestly, I don't know how much that would corrupt somebody to like vaguely see just 3 letters put together and then briefly go away. That one's these are all hand waves from Disney saying, oh, there's nothing to see here, there's a benign explanation for all that. There has not been one for Little Mermaid, as far as I'm aware. In fact, they changed the background art soon after some of the initial releases to like de-dickify the castle a little bit in the background. But the priest with the alleged erection never really got any sort of nod to it. Now there's a lot of other ones too. I mentioned Roger Rabbit, but you rightfully were like, well, Roger Rabbit's kind of like an adult cartoon, like it might be more for adults, so Jessica Rabbit and some of the other references get a bit of a pass. Although they did have a frame in a deleted scenes, I think also Laserdisc release of Roger Rabbit, where Jessica's falling out of a car and the animators, clearly draw her with her legs wide open as she's tumbling. So I mean, those little things, I'm sure someone was like, I'm gonna put this in here. So that aspect of it. But again, this is long after Walt, so any bad blood that Walt had with the animators, I feel like if they snuck in a booby, like, okay, great, Walt still had you, working under duress, essentially long hours, and he would quite literally blackball somebody in the industry or do everything that he could to make sure you didn't have a job again, to maintain this really crazy monopoly over all the animators. I mean, yeah, that's a tragic tale in its own, with the whole like aspect of Don Bluth. Like, he started doing a lot of uncredited work. I think a lot of his work for Sword in the Stone went uncredited. And then he had a riff with Disney and split off, and then ended up doing.
Didn't he have Easter eggs in some of his films?
I don't know if you needed to, because if you look at like the Black Cauldron that he worked on, which was, I think, the final big project that he worked on with Disney, they had to cut some stuff out of that he just overtly had like people melting away and like their skeleton would be revealed afterwards. Like, it would have been really, really intense for a Disney movie. But I don't know. I think it's kind of a good thing that Don Bluth broke away. I almost wish that he had done that from the start. So the on the topic of like these covert hidden symbols and stuff, I personally, I'm the Disney shill, right? Though I worked there for 10 years, so grain of salt. But I really do feel that if anything, it might just be like the artist wanting to do what they do. Like, they don't want to draw Snow White, 10,000 times in a row, unless they can sneak in a nipple here and there. And then maybe all of a sudden it's a little bit more engaging to work on. I don't think any of it is unintentional or coincidental when it's overt, right? There's no way. But like the SFX and the sex thing, I don't know. Like, how much damage would it really do? Oh my god, my kids saw the word SEX. If they knew what they were looking for and they kind of blended the F into an E, and what's that gonna really do? Versus, what is it gonna do to them to say like, hey, here's your parent. Okay, your parent's dead now. Okay, now here's a talking rabbit. The talking rabbit's now your parent. Follow what the talking rabbit says. I feel like that dynamic is infinitely more harmful on a developing mind than seeing the word sex or even seeing a nipple. Oh my god.
Yeah, and continuing on that, I think you did in our other interview. You stated that you felt that Disney overtly was destroying their authority figure or their parent figure through an effigy of the dead mother deer or whatever, so that the child would have to keep going back to Disney through life as that dependable role model, right?
I mean, Bambi's the obvious one because that's the fun one. They're like, oh, they killed Bambi's mom. That actually is one of the least egregious versions of this because that happens a little bit later on in the story. It doesn't happen immediately. If you look at every other Disney movie, it happens way sooner. It's just maybe not as like they don't get shot. Actually, there are some where they do get murdered, but it's usually a kidnapping. A kid gets lost in the city. I mean, there is every single Disney movie is about an underaged, sort of innocent being that gets thrust out into this dangerous world without their authority figures, and they have to then find new authority figures. And it's weird because they're not necessarily authority figures in the same hierarchy that like a child understands. That always ends up being a little sidekick that's like your friend and your helper, and coincidentally they always break this human speaking to animal barrier as well. So you get the nature magic just for free, right? You get one, you get the second for free.
I think that's right. I was talking about it before. That's kind of the hero's journey, though, recycled in a lot of ways, and it makes sense. That can tie it to Star Wars, and the story you just talked about. That's the story of Luke, lost his family. His authority figures who? Yoda, Ben Kenobi. So he's got these other influences on the way.
Yeah. So just to be clear, occult meaning hidden, and kind of stops there. Full stop. Period. It doesn't necessarily have to mean Crowleyan magic or Enochian John D magic or Pizzagate or anything. Always. Sometimes it does, but it doesn't always have to mean something that nefarious. So here's a more benign version of that is like the occult background of Beauty and the Beast, for example. That was written to kind of tell young women that were getting married away to these horrible older, hairy, grumpy men that were like 3 times their age. And it was like, hey, there's maybe a good person down under there. I understand that you've got this arranged marriage and your parents married you away to this horrible creature, this beast as you see him, because you're a young child still, but like just accept it and dance and make him dinner, and then maybe some like at a certain point that beast will turn into like your Prince Charming, or you'll craft him into this beast. But it really was a story of like, hey, life really sucks, we're gonna marry you, you're 14 but we're gonna marry you out to like this 50-year-old dude that lives out in the mountains. Just sorry, this is life, make the best of it. That's really the premise behind Beauty and the Beast in some ways.
I thought it was that, but you got to put Pride and Prejudice back into the conversation again, because the whole Darcy narrative was that he was an asshole and cruel and mean, and she wound up growing to love him too. So he was kind of a beast as well, wouldn't you say?
Right. And you can, again, going into the Golden Bough, this gets mentioned specifically because, again, in the original story, again, Occult, in Beauty and the Beast Disney cartoon, her dad is like some wacky inventor, right? He's the dad from Gremlins that's like can't quite make the perfect thing that elevates them to the next class of society. In the real original story of Beauty and the Beast, her dad is the king. So it throws a completely different dynamic, and now she's getting married away to this beast. Well, the ramifications of somebody marrying a princess, right, would have been they get to inherit the kingdom. So there's way more in it for the beast at that point, in the original, story that goes behind it. And that's just one example of the occulted facts. There's actually 2 of them there, right? One is that it wasn't necessarily, oh, everything's great and you'll go and marry this beast and he turns into Prince Charming. It was like, suck it up, buttercup, this is life. But then on top of that, it again was this inversion, maybe like intentional occulting of the patriarchy versus the matriarchy. And I'm not saying that in a woke sense of the word, but in this Golden Bough approach where patriarchy means nepotism. It directly just means if you come from my loins, you get the king, the keys to the castle. It doesn't matter how corrupt or incompetent you are. Whereas the matriarchy, they always had to be a challenger, that always had to prove their worth, would have to, slay the king. If you can slay the king and win the heart of the princess at the same time, like you kind of earned the keys of the castle. So this again is just another inversion, and I don't know if this means that Walt Disney himself sat down and he's like, I'm going to read the Golden Bough and I'm going to invert it because that's how I want society to be. I don't know if that element happened to it, but again, that serial entrepreneur mindset, he was a unique individual in that he might have had a foot in both of those pools, right? Incredibly talented, right brain creative, but also like a cutthroat, like I'll cut your whole family down and make sure that you starve in order for me to get my way.
That was one thing fascinating. When I last went to Disney, I was staying at one of their resorts because it was tied with the corporate thing, whatever. And it was a Spanish style resort. And I learned that Walt Disney was really close friends with Salvador Dali. And I had no idea that they were thick as thieves.
Dude, there's a crazy tangent here when you brought up Spain, because Walt Disney was also obsessed with Spain. He was marked as a special agent in charge. I believe that's what they called it, an SAC, for the FBI, and he had a letter from J. Edgar Hoover directly, I believe, and basically it seems like they were stringing Walt along by telling him, Walt, your parents that you grew up with aren't your real parents. It sounds like it's straight out of a Disney movie.
That's right.
But Walt always felt, because his dad was cruel to him, and he felt that he was maybe kidnapped as a kid, or maybe he was adopted and his parents just never told him about it. And the FBI gets wind of this, and they sort of, they indulge him quite a bit, and they basically imply that they found his real dad. His dad is from Spanish royalty. He's got like royal blood in him, and that the family is still in Spain. And if you just help try to ferret out some of these communists that might be in Hollywood, we'll keep looking into this for you, and we'll find more details for you to unveil. And man, this just, it paints so much of this extra context around Walt Disney as a person, a human being going through the human condition, having all these flaws, and then the FBI like, no, Walt, you're right. You've always been right. You are adopted. You are a king. You're a prince that was stolen from your kingdom. So he really did have this fascination with like,
dude, that makes so much sense. It makes me think of the David Mamet quote, every fear hides a wish. And it could have been influenced. I mean, David Mamet,
that sounds like a Disney quote,
great playwright, one of the greatest. But wow, I mean, it makes so much sense that he was writing and correcting his own childhood over and over and over,
and playing it out in his own mind, like I am the princess, right? Like I've been kidnapped.
Give credit where it's due. I tend to mock the CIA, FBI, things like that, but in one of my other shows, we talk about how they're not dumb. That was a clever move to feel his weakness of his childhood and to create a story tailor fit that would sound so appealing that he would immediately bite and go along it. That's some slick stuff.
I believe that's from a book called Dark Prince of Hollywood or something like that. It is the unofficial biography of Walt, and I find it to be a really fascinating story. It gets really into a lot of his biases too.
Wow. And okay, on that note, biases back and forth, and you made a point of saying, on the human level, what do you think of Walt Disney? Because I feel like he has been turned into a controversial figure. Do you think he was a net positive or negative?
That's a hard one. Yeah, what bucket do you put him in? I don't know. I do know that he was a very dynamic character. His ties to intelligence just don't end, and I don't know if it was intentional or if he knew about, because like when he grew up, he was in Des Moines, and Des Moines is kind of like Freemasonry for kids, right? It's like their Cub Scout version before you're old enough to join real Freemasonry. And as far as I'm aware, he never joined Freemasonry proper, but he did a bunch of initial, like there's some lodge skits where like Mickey Mouse has like a little apron on and he's going through like a Freemasonic initiation and stuff. But he was actually trained directly under the founder of Des Moines. So we're not just talking about like he happened to be in some chapter. Like he was personally sort of mentored by the founder of Des Moines, and all of the esoteric and occult teachings that go with that. He was there front and center for all of it. And the connections between secret societies and intelligence, I mean, that's kind of what secret societies are. They just share intelligence and they keep secrets. That sounds like what the CIA is, except this might be like the private sector version in some ways. So Walt was clearly knowledgeable of occult information. He knew about how secrets worked. He had always felt like an outsider that was, kidnapped as a child. So he had a very strong conspiratorial mindset. And when he started getting into Hollywood and bumping up against all the true entrepreneurs and the true money makers, he just kind of saw like the whole world working against him. And I think that turned him a little way. Like he probably stopped being as lackadaisical and whimsical, outside of the movies and the product. But he put all that whimsy, I think, into the cartoons themselves, but it got all drained from his regular life. And towards the end, he was a really strange individual. Like Epcot, the original concept for Epcot was this like dystopian nightmare of a society where like you had to be employed, you couldn't be disabled. If anything happened to you where you retired or you hurt yourself or you couldn't work, you weren't allowed to live in Epcot anymore. Experimental prototype community of the future, or of tomorrow, what it stood for. So like he had a lot of wacky ideas, but he had the FU money to back it up, right? Imagine, like Elon Musk, but it's Walt Disney, and Walt Disney's got a bone to pick with, all people on both sides of the aisle. So what I think about Walt Disney is that imagine if you took like a robber baron of like a JP Morgan, but also gave them this creative, right-brained aspect of looking at things. It was such a unique individual, but I haven't heard any stories that anyone that worked directly for him that loved the experience. Like they love being part of owning nostalgia, but not necessarily working directly for Walt Disney or under the conditions that he imposed on people. And he was, I don't want to use the I don't want to say like an overseer, but he was kind of like drove people like you worked at the Disney plantation. That was the impression that I got from anyone that was much closer to actually, working directly with Walt.
Whoa, that's amazing. Now, to wrap this up, and I have a feeling we're going to have to bring you back and we'll just talk about one conspiracy or another, or one occult thing or another. So we'll wrap this one as the Disney intro. What is the one question that I should have asked you, but I did not?
Oh, if I know where Walt's frozen body is, maybe.
Oh, hey, there's a go. Where is Walt's frozen body?
And I've spoke with I've got a good friend Eddie, who has a channel called Synchronous on Twitter, and he gets way into this, but he went to Caltech arts, where he was rubbing shoulders and working with a lot of these animators that were on the West Coast, because I'm on the East Coast, so I got like the overflow experiences and stuff. But he actually was like down in the trenches with other straight up Disney animators, and that's a topic of endless fascination. Apparently, there's still theories that he's buried somewhere in the basements or under the area of Caltech, and that maybe his head is like being preserved out there. I think those are fun to think about, like in a Futurama kind of way. I don't necessarily know, but the cryogenic Walt thing is one of my favorite topics for a number of reasons. But I came across people that still believe in cryogenic preservation to this day, believe in this concept of first in, last out, or last in, first out, which if you're into like computers and programming, like heaps and stacks and stuff. But essentially it means that if I die, from some incurable disease and they freeze me, but then they find the cure to that disease in 6 months from now, there's much better chance that they might be able to unfreeze me and thaw me out without major damage to my organs and everything else, just from like frostbite, because I've been frozen the least amount of time. So therefore, anyone that was frozen in like the 60s or 70s or 80s, like you're going to be waiting a very, very long time until they thaw you back out. So that's one of my favorite premises, that even if Walt Disney did cryogenically freeze his body to, come back to life later, like he's not going to be thawed out until like the year 3000 plus, probably.
Wow, that's a perfect place to leave this on, and let's hope that this interview is still there for people to discover in 3000. Tom, thank you so much, man.
Thank you, man. This is fun. We got to do this some more.